Okay, I think we will get started. I am Liz Powell. I am the founder of G2G Consulting, and I get to kick things off today. But I am really excited about our speakers. You won't hear much from me. You'll be hearing from today's speakers. We have a great lineup, and we want to hear from you. We're going to close out with questions and a chance for you to ask whatever you need to know to help lead a very effective advocacy campaign for your organization. So first off, I'm going to give a little bit of background. So I started G2G 15 years ago after meeting many fascinating change makers, both entrepreneurs and nonprofits, doing great things and wanting to do more with government. And improve sort of advocacy efforts. And so over the 15 years, I built a great bipartisan team, and we do a lot of work with nonprofits. And we sort of hear common questions over the years. And so what we thought today, we could bring folks together to address a lot of the common questions that we get. Before starting G2G, I worked on Capitol Hill as a legislative director, and worked for a couple different members of Congress and did a lot in health and social policy. I've also run a PAC, a political action committee. I've worked on a lot of political campaigns and led a lot of grassroots campaign efforts. So our speakers, though, have way more experience and have done just amazing things over the years to really make a difference in Washington. So we want to make sure you get to hear from them first and foremost. So we've got our first two speakers are folks that have worked in government. Amy Sanchez has worked for several years in the U.S. Senate and has an impressive background staffing the Senate Small Business Committee. She's also done amazing other things, ranging from Amazon to other consulting firms. She's just got a fantastic background, even worked in the Pentagon. Following her is Katie Collins, who used to work for President Obama, then Vice President Biden, was one of the key staff on the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. She then helped launch the Biden Cancer Initiative and continued to work on health advocacy for Act for NIH, working to make sure there's enough funding at NIH for so many critical health issues. She will be followed by David Hysong, who is the founder and CEO of both Shepherd Therapeutics and Shepherd Foundation. He has an amazing story, his own background he will share, but has become quite the leader in rare cancers, a pioneer in that space. He will be followed by Chris McGinty, who is the executive director of AmericaView, which focuses on remote sensing. It's a consortium of professors and experts in remote sensing, which we all use for GPS and other things and may not even realize it. He has run an amazing organization, really grown that over the years, and he'll share his story. And then we'll close out with Tammy Boyd, who has worked just about every sector of advocacy, very amazing background, currently is Vice President of American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, but also was the Chief of Policy for Black Women's Health Imperative and former legislative director on the Hill, and has also worked in industry. And then we will take your questions. And so if you have questions while we're speaking, please speak up in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We definitely want to hear from you. With that, I will pass it over to Amy.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Really appreciate you having me come on and explain the convoluted process that is Congress. I'm going to kind of go over the federal budget process, how to work with appropriations, as well as how to engage on policy with authorizing committees. I'm going to give you some kind of theory based on how it should work, and then kind of, in my experience, how things have tended to deviate, based on various circumstances. In terms of the federal budget process, if you could show the timeline. Yeah. Kicking off the process, we have the president's budget request. It is what the president requests for each program codified by law. From a practical perspective, the budget request is actually incredibly helpful for those outside of the process, like nonprofit organizations, because it really drills down on how each department and agency is prioritizing its programs for the year. I know Katie's going to talk about how to work with the administration, but if you have a White House and a chamber of Congress that's friendly with each other, for example, a Democratic White House and a Democratic Senate, you can figure out how to associate your advocacy with those priorities as you talk to members in that chamber based on whether or not they are friendly or not. Next in the process, Congress comes up with the budget resolution, which sets the upper limit of spending in any given area. Each chamber comes up with its own resolution, then they work to hammer out the differences. Just know on this, sometimes Congress will skip this step entirely or use an alternative 2-year agreement, which will set spending caps for those years. After the budget resolution, the Appropriations Committee for each chamber divides the amount allotted for federal agency funding between 12 subcommittees. This is really kind of the bulk of your interactions for for dealing with funding requests. Each subcommittee is in charge of funding for different functions of government, such as defense spending. You got defense appropriations, energy and water, interior and environment, so on. And then those agencies that are responsible for those areas. Just kind of a side note, congressional committees are primarily authorizing committees. These committees are responsible for creating policy, the statutory programs that will ultimately get funded through the appropriations process. Each authorizing committee is responsible over a specific department or set of agencies, as well as a set of topics. The Senate, for example, has 16 standing committees with legislative jurisdiction. There's only one appropriations committee. The rest are all authorizing. So really keep that in mind when you consider the makeup as you kind of look at how you're kind of defining your activities for a year or a set time period and what you hope to get out of that legislative activity. Each appropriations subcommittee will conduct hearings with agency leaders about their budget requests and draft appropriations bills, setting the funding for each. Once the bills have made their way past their respective committees, the full House and Senate will vote on their bills. They'll reconcile the difference and then vote on an identical version of each bill. As you can see from the timeline, at each stage of the process, there are things that you can do as an organization to kind of help your funding request. And it's also worth noting that every aspect of this process is really subject to circumstances and kind of what's going on in the kind of whether it's in the chamber or in the world at large. Most often this deviates if we're in an election year, especially if there's a presidential election or if there's a large scale public catastrophe like a pandemic or an economic crisis or both. Additionally, the first step in the process, the budget resolution, if that is late, every stage of the process thereafter will get pushed back as well. You often see that in the first budget submitted by a new president. So it's important to know what stage of the process Congress is in when you're making any kind of ask, whether it's funding or policy. I should also point out that authorizing committees can authorize at any time the chamber is in session, with the exception of the annual defense bill, which tends to typically follow the appropriations process in terms of timing. You aren't really constrained by the calendar in terms of trying to codify policy changes into law. This type of advocacy, ones without funding associated with it, can give you an opportunity to meet with members and can help you identify champions for later requests that do perhaps require funding and still make a positive long-term impact on advancing your legislative goals with a lower associated risk. As nonprofit organizations, I should also, in terms of funding, I should also point out that you are eligible for a separate set of funding. If we could go to the next slide. Federal earmarks, these are just set aside for requests from members of Congress. Just know that neither chamber likes the term earmark, so we call it different things based on what chamber you're in. In the House, we call it community project funding. In the Senate, we call it congressionally directed spending. Generally, we define this type of funding as congressionally directed spending, tax or tariff that would benefit any entity or a specific state or locality or congressional district. Because this funding is specified to a specific recipient, like you as a nonprofit, it's not subject to the competitive award process. It goes to you. In the House, there are, I think members are limited to 10 per member, and in the Senate, doesn't have any limit, but both chambers are subject to pretty strict public disclosure and transparency guidelines set forth by each chamber. As organizations, your continuing relationship with a member can go a long way to determining whether your request is included in a final appropriations bill. Additionally, requests that are data-driven and show your organization is meeting a demonstrable need in your members' district will receive the greatest consideration. For authorizing committees, this is kind of separate from the appropriations process, but you want to look at this in terms of kind of timing and what else is going on in the chamber. There are a number of different ways to engage with these committees from a policy perspective, even just outside of legislation, that can be used to establish a relationship with a member other than your own. These committees, authorizing committees, are responsible for oversight and investigative functions. They'll hold hearings, conduct investigations, issue reports, and often these are not necessarily tied to any specific bill. So you have opportunities to engage outside of just coming up with, a way you want to change the law. Even if you're not a witness in a hearing, depending on the committee, you can also give written testimony after the fact. In the Senate, they're also responsible for confirming nominees. So offering questions to staff once you've kind of started to develop that relationship with committee staff that can be posed to a nominee for the record, or offering letters from your organization outlining issues you think the committee should consider when they consider, that particular nominee. These are all really good ways and often overlooked ways of engaging committees that can potentially help you reach your legislative goal. I will say, in terms of some of the things I found most effective from organizations coming to me in my time in Congress, I worked on an authorizing committee for 8.5 years. I worked for 4 different senators, all of whom had, kind of their own priorities for the committee. I had a number of, organizations that came through and sat in front of me in my time working for the committee. Really the number one kind of, I would say, Congress hack is bipartisan support, whether it was legislation or simply an oversight letter. Those with bipartisan support generally got more traction than those that didn't. I think the second, organizations that could effectively use both data and human elements to tell a story tend to get a lot more consideration from staff members, member-based organizations, folks that could come in from the, district and talk to staff about, kind of what's going on in the district and how their organization is looking to address a particular problem. Staff are people. They're not immune to kind of some of the emotional arguments, and so long as those were married with really good data, those organizations tended to do really well. Third, organizations that looked at their relationships with members and staff as long-term investments generally had better interactions over time than those organizations that kind of looked at it as like one-off transactions. And the last, I think, is those who know how to work both inside and outside of a coalition really did, I think, really well in terms of kind of interacting and getting things out of staff and members. Organizations that could harness the power of a larger group to further their own organization's priorities tended to get a lot more attention from members, and they were able to better bring together members who wouldn't necessarily work together otherwise. And this is really important when you're trying to get bipartisan support. So just keep that in mind. So that's what I have for working with Congress. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Katie Collins, to talk about working with the administration.
Thanks, Amy. And Amy has done a great job of going over the details of working with Congress. And that's a lot of what folks think about when they think about government engagement, is calling their senator, calling their representative, weighing in on legislation. getting funding, as Amy's just gone through that process, but I don't want to overlook the importance of engaging with agencies as well as the White House. The White House will set priorities throughout agencies, and there really is a lot of room to gain traction, bring attention to your organization, your issue, the policies that you're looking to change or to move forward, et cetera. So we'll talk about agencies for a moment. There are funding opportunities, as many of you know, through federal agencies. Grants are the ones that you may think about most commonly, but there's also contracts, broad agency announcements that reflect priorities, wide-ranging across the agencies, specific program announcements, the opportunity for pilot projects. So never forget that there are funding opportunities within most of the federal agencies that you'd be working with, depending on what your policy area is. It is a great way to shape the priorities and policy development within an agency, as well as their programming and their spending. Identifying what an agency is looking at currently, and how does your work fit in to what they're doing? How can you demonstrate alignment? How can you help further those goals? Are all things to think about when you're engaging with agency relationships. And it's, agencies can help with Congress. There are liaisons within each agency that work with Congress. So agencies can give a push to your congressional work and vice versa. It's important to remember that they work closely together. And utilizing government resources. In the health space, which is where I'm from in particular, there are a lot of data, there's a lot of information within federal agencies, particularly DoD, VA, and depending on the specifics with those policies for those agencies, as well as, who might be on your team. Are you collaborating with federal researchers that might allow you to get access to that type of data or information is really important to think about. My experience is really in the White House, so I can talk a little bit about White House collaboration. Amy went through that whole federal budget process, and one of the first steps in that process is the development and the release of the president's annual budget. It doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of what actually is enacted, but what it does do is reflect the White House's priorities and where they really want to see funding. So, sending a letter to the White House, to the Office of Management and Budget, reflecting, where you'd like to see money going, talking about how that furthers the administration's priorities, and really having a line item for your topic or policy area within the annual POTUS budget means a lot. And let you go to Congress and say, hey, we're in the president's budget. Look at this robust funding that the president's allotted. This is a White House priority. We can work with you on how to make this happen. So there is that particular budget piece that you can utilize within the White House. Again, priorities, programming, and policy. I came from the Cancer Moonshot Task Force. We were a small group of just about 10 within the White House, and we relied a lot on expertise from the cancer community, from stakeholders, across the arena, whether it's clinicians, patients, advocates, who really, have expertise in a particular area, can share that with us, can talk about why, for example, clinical trials, structuring and redevelopment is important, why data standards and sharing are important, and advise us on the best way to shape policy that's actionable and that's meaningful. So those letters that you send to the White House, or those conversations that you reach out to White House staff to have, I think can be very, very impactful. And they also elevate, selfishly, they elevate your organization and your policy goals. being able to say that you're collaborating with the White House, being able to say that there is, presidential or agency attention to your issue, gives you credence and shows that the highest level of government is focusing there. So I would say with the current administration today, if you're focused on racial equity, if you're focused on healthcare innovation, on pandemic preparedness, on infrastructure, those are all things that this administration really cares about and is really engaging with. So I think those are strong areas that would warrant a letter and outreach to the agencies and to the White House. I'm just going to note we do have a Q&A and a chat box, so happy to get into some specific questions at the end. But I am going to stop sharing my screen because I'd like to introduce David Hysong from Shepherd Therapeutics and the Shepherd Foundation, who's really going to be able to give the perspective of someone who has successfully worked with agency leaders, with congressional leaders, with the White House on how to advance policies for rare cancer patients. So David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Folks, it's a pleasure to be here. I never thought that I would be on Capitol Hill doing this work, or that I'd be speaking to you about a pretty successful 4 or 5 years that we've had. So for those of you who do not know, I was diagnosed with a rare form of head and neck cancer about 8 years ago. I did not have a background in policy work. I did not have a background in biotech or the cancer space. I had actually been an investigator working against human trafficking and sexual slavery in Southeast Asia, and then was trying to join our nation's military. So my diagnosis sent me down an unplanned path. And so I set up Shepherd 8 months after my own diagnosis. Early on, we knew that we wanted to take a very broad look at this issue and take an end-to-end approach, including affecting federal policy. So we met Liz and the team and began our work on Capitol Hill. And we started with pretty humble ambitions, which was simply to look at what non-dilutive funding was out there in the rare cancer space. And that work has ballooned and blossomed to the point that I think that to date, I know that we have more than $100 million of additional funds that we've gotten through appropriations. We've secured new line items. I think I have personally met with every single senator and congressperson in the United States of America. I think we've had sit downs with every major federal agency. We've co-authored a comprehensive piece of federal legislation that has been introduced in the House and now the Senate. We've briefed Congress for 5 years running now. So I say all that to highlight the fact that I'm a blue collar guy from Kentucky with a cancer diagnosis. And I think that we've been able to leverage and get some great advice, which has turned this into a pretty successful campaign. So thinking back on the things that made us successful, and we hope will continue to, one of those is the most powerful thing that I do is share my story, and sharing that story in person. So again, I used to go to DC for 3 or 4 day trips, and I swear we would have 20 meetings a day. But the ability to connect with a staffer or a congressperson on an individual level and simply to express your story with feeling, with authenticity, with emotion, and just connect on a human level is a major differentiator. It makes them not forget you. And the ability to take that individual story and tie it to a much more national and broader issue has been a big piece of our work. So I'm a rare cancer patient, but there are hundreds of thousands of rare cancer patients across the United States diagnosed every single year. And so thinking through how to take my individual story and tie it into a national problem that impacts both specific districts and specific states, and then also the nation writ large was a big thing. So I wasn't going in making an individual connection and asking for something selfish. I was asking for an increase in funding and federal policy changes that would impact close to 1 million patients every single year. So the ability to combo those two things has been really important in our work and in our approach. I also can tell this story and gain a listening ear from the most conservative Republican to the most liberal Democrat. And I think that recognizing that you are going to be working with and achieving common ground with people that you might disagree with on every other issue under the sun, but the ability to speak to the problem in terms that they will be able to relate to and that they will understand has been a big piece. And so again, we've had bipartisan support for all of our initiatives, and I consider both Republicans and Democrats close allies in this. So that thinking through how to take your individual story, that's your hook, and then turn that into a national issue that impacts both sides of the aisle and people from all walks of life has been a big piece. And so I think that storytelling component is also extremely important. There's a way to talk about molecular diagnostics and rare cancer that is not compelling, and there's a way to do it that makes it hit home. And so talking about the way that these cancers impact veterans and minorities and women and children, the young and the old, making it really stick, and making very clear how your issue is pertinent, and just how much it impacts all walks of life, but to make that tangible and recognizable and relatable has been a big piece as well. So those are some of the kind of big takeaways that have come from our work. If I was giving advice to someone, I'd tell them, one, to buckle up for a 10-year fight or more. I think that if you're really looking to have a major federal impact long-term, or even state level, you have to understand, again, the processes that take place, just how slow this can be, that you might work for 5 years or more, and then all of a sudden become a, quote, overnight sensation. So I think recognizing this is a long-term play is a very big piece of this, and that nothing can substitute for a great strategy that both the high and the low, the really humble small wins in the big picture, and nothing is a substitute for showing up in person and continuing to just knock on doors and share your story. So those are a couple of the things that I found most helpful, most compelling, the things that have informed our work at Shepherd. And I'll just finish by saying that we intend to, every victory we see is simply a stepping stone to the next push, the next endeavor. So if this federal piece of legislation is passed, which I hope it will be, it's just prepping us for the next legislation that we will continue to drive forward, author, and push forward. So take a long-term view, be willing to do the most humble of activities as well as the biggest, and think through the way in which your story relates to a broader population, and just never give up. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, David. And I think we're going to turn it over to Chris now to share a bit about his experience with America View. So over to you, Chris.
All right. Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here, and appreciate everybody who's joined us today. I think this is a great conversation, and thank David for all of his great insights, because he covered a lot of the things that I think are really important. So just a little bit about America View. We're an organization that was established in 2003, really as a way to facilitate the use and understanding of publicly available Earth observation satellite data through outreach, applied research, workforce development, and technology transfer. So we're in a little bit of a different niche here than David and his group, but also it's really impressive how many things are similar when you're advocating for something, especially on the Hill, and you're working with folks to further your goals and your vision. Our consortium, or our network, is now 41 states, and like I said, we do a lot of this education and outreach. We really have done a lot of focus in the K through 12 and undergraduate levels, but also one of the unique things about America View is that it really its members tackle local and regional issues where remote sensing and Earth observation might be useful. And this could be anything from community growth to development and natural resource management, disaster response, or a host of other things that our folks work on across the country. So it's a pretty broad organization in what we do, and most of the work that we do is federally funded, really to promote the use of satellite data that is federally funded as well. So one of the things that America View did initially when they spun up in 2003 with 10 charter members was to start going to the Hill. Now, this was part of an education and outreach effort, and this was not a lobbying effort. This was not something they were out actively seeking additional funding for, but they were building relationships. And so David mentioned the importance of this long vision. Buckle up for this long ride that you're going to have to sit down and really work towards. You're going to have that view. You're also going to have to allow that view to adapt over time. And so something that happened in our world was there was a free and open data policy that came about with respect to the satellite imagery that we used. So we had to adjust our vision of what we were doing and our mission to really pivot to more of the education and outreach and technology transfer, workforce development, rather than promoting the use of the data, because the data became free. But actually what that did was made our activities and what we needed to do even more important, because we started really interfacing more at the human level, if you will, with kids and teachers and educators across the country. So some of the things that we learned over this time were that rules really do tend to change. Rules on the Hill change, administrations change, those rules can change, the game changes. And so you have to be really aware of how that game is changing. And as we've grown to 41 members, and that's a whole lot of congressional folks to visit on the Hill, it's hard to adapt and meet those changes as you're working through all of the different nuances of visiting staffers. You can call a staffer up and go meet them at any time, but really to understand how to make that communication impactful and to tell your story is something that we had to learn over the years. And so we had interfaced with G2G a number of years ago, but it didn't, due to circumstances within our organization, that didn't pan out. We continued our advocacy with respect to our group on the Hill, but we didn't make the connections that we needed to. And so some of the important things that we were learning, we were doing the hard way, and we were really struggling in some cases to make those connections and continue sustaining those connections. So we'd done okay, but we hadn't done perfect. And so as we really realized that just simply educating members on the Hill was great, it wasn't doing the whole trick. And so we really got engaged with Liz and her team to understand better how that we could tell this story, how we could show our passion for what we do, so that we could build that support and then ultimately look towards building that funding level and that annual bump that we wanted to see, so that we could grow to all 50 states and territories, and we could fund our states in a way that was really meaningful, that they could have a sustained program through time. So just a couple of insights, I guess I would say, some of the things you really need to understand what your staffers or what your members are passionate about. And David mentioned this, and American View has been very bipartisan, and that's been a fantastic benefit, because folks really understand the benefit of using this type of information, at least within our realm, to help support local communities, to help teach kids, to help really promote the use of this data for agriculture, all these things that we can resonate with our Hill members. And then in a couple of other things that we realized that, some people tackle grand challenges. I would say what David and his group are doing are grand challenges, and these are impressive and amazing things, but staffers, they love that. And they also love local challenges. They also love to hear those local stories. They want to know about a kid who learned how to fly a drone, right? Or a student in Wyoming that learned to use satellite data and then went back to his family farm and applied that to help benefit their community. And so, grand challenges are amazing, and so are local challenges. So never think that your challenge or what you're promoting is something that's not going to be beneficial to a staffer or going to be resonating with them. And that just gets to the hook, what catches the eye. So make sure that you have that hook that you can really bring somebody in. And ultimately, I think what has benefited us, and especially this last year, most of our visits were virtual, which was fine, but we really had an opportunity to key in to what our impact was over almost 20 years. What was our impact nationally? What was it locally? What was it personally? So how can we tie that to the folks that we're talking to? And I think those were really key things. And never be afraid to just ask. I mean, the worst thing that you get told is no. And I think one of the things that we've been hesitant about, over developing our plans forward was really just, understanding what it was we were asking for and not being afraid of it. And certainly Liz definitely helped us with that. So I think I'll leave it at that. I think the last thing I would say is just, you really do have to have that long-term vision, but you can also have short-term success. And again, I liked what David said, is one success leads to the next, and you just continue to fight for that next opportunity to really key in on what it is you're trying to advocate for in your organization. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chris. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Tammy Boyd to talk about her work with ACS CAN. And again, her resume and the advocacy side is huge, so she can share some broad strokes about her experiences. So Tammy, over to you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Katie. Many of what Chris and also David said definitely resonates. First, let me start with saying I'm with the American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, and we are the advocacy arm of the American Cancer Society. We ourselves, we have a broad legislative agenda, from increasing funding for NIH and the National Cancer Institute, multi-cancer detection. We're also we're also supporting and advocating for diversity in clinical trials around the Diverse Trials Act. And much of what David and Chris have said definitely holds true. Make sure you meet with your members of Congress. It's also very important to amplify your particular story. Chris mentioned, looking in your district, looking at the looking at really how it impacts that particular district itself of that member of Congress, and just bringing home your story. And then also, I definitely agree with, really set in for the long haul. I previously worked on the Capitol Hill as legislative director for Congressman John Lewis, and worked on the passage of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And that had been an effort for over 15 years. I came there and, really built upon many of the smaller successes that the previous legislative folks had worked on to really bring home the strategy. But it was really a 15-year effort just for Congressman Lewis. Before that, there was Mickey Leland, who had also worked on the legislation. And so it is definitely a long-term strategy. So I've worked on the Hill. I've also worked for lobby for a major Fortune 30 company. Also, I've been at a smaller nonprofit, and then also now I'm at American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network. And so I would definitely say, just generally your issue itself, there's the Capitol Hill, which we've heard about, but then there's also the White House. So it's really a multi-strategy. You want to look at, when you're looking at a particular issue, you want to look at the agency, if there's a regulatory route. You want to also look at the White House, obviously, and then you also want to look at Capitol Hill. And then there's also a media component that you may, for example, you may open your New York Times or your Washington Post and you see an ad, and it has several logos of different patient advocacy groups that are advocating for a particular issue. So definitely do not overlook the media advocacy component, whether that's newspaper, radio, or television. And you really want to develop that strategy. Also, you want to look, for example, if you're an advocate, if you're a single organization, you may also want to look, for example, advocating as your organization. So for many times we advocate as American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, but then we also participate in several coalitions where we come together to advocate for a particular issue. What I can say is they're not, you want to be strategic in it, but they're never, it's never just reach out to your member of Congress one time. You want to have multiple touches in multiple ways to those offices. And you want to use all the different ways. So for example, it may be, if you're seeing that it's you're hitting an impasse on Capitol Hill on your particular issue, you may say, okay, well, what can we do on the regulatory, the agency route? And I'll give like a quick example, which is kind of a non-healthcare example. But for example, with our National Museum of African American History and Culture, our initial support when we were able to move the legislation actually came from the White House. And they signaled that they were supportive. And then, we also looked at, for example, you want to look at your relevant committees to your legislation. So if it's, in healthcare, if it's the Energy and Commerce, the Ways and Means, or, on the Senate side, the Senate Finance Committee or the Senate Health Committee, or it may be an appropriations issue. You want to sort of look at, those different committees. You also look at those chairs. You also want to look at your leadership. And so I would say, sort of bringing all of what you've heard is that once you are developing your White House, you really don't want to develop your strategies in a silo. So you want to develop your White House. You want to develop your Capitol Hill, your media strategy. All those things together to kind of figure out how you can accelerate or push your issue on multiple cylinders. So again, I'm really supporting everything that Katie, Chris, and David have said. And I will also highlight the in my opinion, as being a staffer on the Hill, the amplifying the patient's story is just so important. I really can't underscore how important that is, because it really helps that individual member or that individual staffer really understand what you are dealing with. The particular patient is dealing with, their experiences, what their journey is, and so and then even how that's relevant, if you're in their particular district, if there's something that's tailored of the barrier that may be particular in that particular district. Those things are just really extremely powerful. At the end of the day, the amplifying the story is really a key component. And I can turn it back over to Katie.
Hi, thank you so much, Tammy, for that, for all of your comments. I thought that was so illuminating to have each of you share your experiences and your expertise from that experience. I think it's really important to understand all the things that advocacy can do. It's great for awareness and education, building relationships, reordering priorities, whether it's the White House's priorities in the budget proposal that Katie talked about, or in the appropriations process and the authorization of legislation that Amy talked about. Getting just on the radar. We definitely found that with both rare cancer and remote sensing data. Both of those were kind of like, what? And so we had to get on the radar. We had to go back over and over again to make sure folks understood that. Advocacy is great for actually changing policy. And as Tammy talked about, that's both within Congress, but also over at agencies. There's tons of regulatory policy changes that happen daily. So you can impact those as well. And then advocacy is key for funding. We talked a lot about increasing funding, but it also impacts cutting. It impacts where they redirect funding. This huge ARPA-H initiative is because people kept pounding the pavement saying we need more funding for medical innovation, that there's this valley of death that's unaddressed. And then finally, although this is not an exclusive list, but the big one, systemic change. Advocacy is absolutely central to systemic change, which is what I think many of us really care about. The other two comments I wanted to make before we do Q&A, voting really matters. If you have not voted, please vote. You can vote early, get your friends to vote. That's really, really critical. And also nonprofits are allowed to lobby and do advocacy. I get this question all the time, but as long as it represents 20% or less of your budget, you are totally fine. You can talk to your members of Congress. There's also ways to talk to people in government without lobbying. You could just be educating on an issue and never even talking about legislation. That is considered not lobbying. That's just education. So if there's ever concerns about what nonprofits can and can't do, please let us know about that, because you certainly can engage. That's all perfectly legal. So with that, we'd love to have all our speakers come back up, show their beautiful faces, and we will take some questions. I see the first question is, what's the best way to advocate without crossing the line as a lobbyist? Oh, which I kind of just touched on a little bit, but why don't we start with Amy, our lawyer, and we can kind of pass it around and see who else wants to chime in on that one.
Yeah, my first instinct as a lawyer to say, obviously I'm a lawyer, but not your lawyer. So please advice is general. One of the ways that we, I think, kind of encourage nonprofits to engage with members, if you've got an organization that, let's say your board is particularly concerned about, the appearance of lobbying, educating members, and also avoiding, talking about specific bills, keeping it to general topics. Those are ways that you can kind of, definitely avoid crossing into lobbying territory generally, and still be able to interact with your member of Congress if you keep it about education and just avoid, specific bills with bill numbers.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I think I'll chime in on that really quick. We did about 18 years of educating members of Congress, and that was something that you know, we had to walk a very fine line, and a lot of our funding coming from Interior, USGS in particular. They wanted us to advocate for what they're doing, right? But we had to be very cautious that we were not asking for changes in, or budget increases, or looking at legislation and talking about that. Now, if we were asked a question, say they asked what we needed to do something, we could address certain things, and we could take that back to the legislative affairs folks within the agency. And so that was something that I think it made it a little harder, but it also gave us that leeway to go to the Hill, to educate, to put that hook out there and show them what we're doing, but also made it, once we found our opportunity to move into actually working with G2G, we had those relationships established, but we could then, take it one step further from our national perspective. Now, we still have to be careful with our members, because they receive federal funding, and we want to make sure that if you're going to do that, you need to have some clear boundaries and how that is all set up and works. And we go through multiple audits per year to make sure that we're doing things we're supposed to be doing the right way. And so having that background to be able to say, we have siloed a couple things. So our lobbying and congressional work like that is in one part, but our education, it's still important for our principal investigators to tell what their programs are doing within their states. So it's tricky, but it can be done. And that you just got to remember educating. You're telling them what you're doing and the good things you're doing. You're not saying we want this. So anyway, just 17 years of doing that.
And as the lawyer
yeah,
here,
go ahead.
I'll just chime. I mean, so again, no legal background, but the advice that I often give people, Chris and Amy really talked about educating. I think talking about policies, generally speaking, and the types of policies that are helpful. If you're representing a specific patient community, what would help patients. Again, as long as you're not referencing, please vote for this bill. We want to keep those words out, but I think advocating generally for policies that help, your patients, your stakeholders, your community is certainly okay. And that's often, what legislators and members of the agency or White House staff want to hear from you. What do you see as being the need?
Yeah, thank you. So another question is related to a conversation David and I had with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee overall, and then the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee, which is the big one for all the sort of human service issues. She said to me and David, when she heard David's story and heard about rare cancer, you got to get loud. She's like, that is how you do it. So I would love to hear from both David and Tammy, because you both have done a lot of this sort of grassroots mobilization, and you both have been very successful in getting loud. And I think there's lots of ways to get loud. So I would love to hear from both of you on that one.
Tammy, after you, ma'am, if you'd like to go first.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, definitely in terms of getting loud, that would be, for example, when we had our leadership summit and lobby day, we had 700 cancer volunteers, volunteers and our field staff come to the Hill, and we literally met with every member of Congress office. You saw like these light blue American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network shirts across the Hill. But then that's also, for example, even after you have those initial touch points, following up with the office, they say, hey, yes, I'm supportive, I will sign on to this legislation. Don't just stop there. Then you go back to the district and you then send a follow-up to make sure they signed on to the bill, or see, are there any other questions, or are there any other resources that I can get? And again, the media component is also a way of getting loud, making sure it's in different publications, op-eds. It doesn't necessarily have to be taking out a big ad, and it could be just writing the local paper in that member's district. So there definitely in terms of getting loud, there's several, different strategies. It's not just, make a phone call or go in to meet with the member. You have to keep coming back and keep coming back and really to get on their radar screen. And even if you seem like, I'll turn it over to Dave, even if it seems like it's a lot, it's not, because all the other groups are doing the same. So you are really trying to make sure you help them understand that and articulate that your issue is important and you need them to address it.
I'll follow up and just say, yeah, I completely agree with what Tammy did. And I think that that's a beautiful example of, I think that you can think about getting loud in one of a couple ways. And one of those is sheer kind of numbers and volumes, just how motivated and just how much you can call together grassroots, efforts to just canvass Congress and canvass and just make certain that they just cannot avoid you. I think one of the loudest things that I've ever witnessed is our director of patient advocacy, Brandy Lee Schafrin, who lost her 4-year-old son to rare pediatric cancer, sit in an office and tell a story that brought congressmen to tears over and over and over again. So I think that as much as it's about numbers, again, I've mentioned on storytelling before, I think it's a huge piece. And so figuring out not avoiding the hard truths and the difficult things to make your story a reality. And so the ability to sit there and look in somebody's eyes and explain to them, this isn't abstract anymore. Like, my child died after they experienced all of these things because of this policy. That, I think, sticks with folks in a really meaningful way. And then following that up with constant, call it communication or harassment, constant pressure. These are our elected representatives. It is their job to listen to us. And so not allowing them off the hook for that, because I think it's very easy for them to get lost in policy abstractions and this and that. So making it as loud as possible in their inner conscience, I think, is a big piece. And then we think a lot about what story is going, what's the angle. There's always 10 different ways to tell a story, all of which are equally true. So which piece of the issue are you highlighting for a specific member or a specific time period to make certain that it's not lost in the fray?
Yeah, those are great points. So how do you define success when it comes to advocacy? That's sort of a big question, and I think you guys have touched on sort of short and long term and those things, but defining success in advocacy, I think, is a really important question to answer so that people understand what they're getting into. So I open this up to anyone who would like to go first on this one. How do you define success in advocacy? And I'm going to call you out if you don't jump in.
I'll jump in really quick. All right.
Okay.
I think in terms of what we do, defining success is also about recognition, right? Recognition of what it is you're bringing to the Hill, if you will, if you're whoever you're advocating to, but that recognition that you've been there before, they know your story. I think, the stories that can be told, with respect to, the groups, the people here are very compelling. And I think that if you can identify those successes, yes, we had success this year on the Hill. There's no doubt about it. It was fantastic. We saw members from Interior Subcommittee noting that the program that we were funded by was important, and by being important, they applied to boost that bottom line, and so we see that as a success. But I think that grander success is having people recognize who you are, what you're doing, that you have been there enough, that you have, as David, it is a minor harassment, right? It is that you are going in and you are telling your story, and that staffer is probably going to leave next year. You're going to go and tell it again, but that story is staying in that office. And I talk a lot about the Hill, but certainly within your agencies, making that known to and within the community. And one of the things I didn't touch on earlier, and I think gets to that success, is the local community, as is working with local folks that make legislation within your community, because that percolates up, right? So especially here in Utah, and we work across 41 different states, but by talking locally to our university representatives and to folks that make the laws within it, they communicate. And so when those communications start happening, you have more of that realization and you have more of that success. So it's a roundabout way of saying that, there's success on different levels, but I think, you have to identify what those successes are and kind of keep those, as your targets as you're working through your advocacy program.
I think a big thing for me is I think you have to believe that victory is possible. And I think you have to, I would really encourage folks not to compromise on a definition of success. I think that the political realm and the business realm, and we operate in both of them, are threatening, and there are places where oftentimes you have to settle for a small win today to move forward tomorrow. But I think so often it's so easy to get frustrated and to just accept that this will never happen, or this change will never, reach the magnitude that I want it to reach. And I think that you can't think that way. I think victory has to be possible. I think you have to never settle. I think that for every parent or advocate or patient that simply refuses to take no for an answer, you might never reach the end that we might never realize the full set of ends that I want to achieve at Shepherd. But by refusing to dumb down, or refusing to speak the proper language, or to be, I don't want to say politically correct, but I think you just continue to be unabashed, to be unapologetic, and to say no, until every cancer patient in the country may never survive, right? We may never get to a curative date to that. But every single day that a pediatric patient has no access to therapeutics is a day that something is wildly wrong. And so I think it's so important to remind folks that they don't get to compromise. But I think it starts with us as advocates. And so by refusing to compromise and refusing to dumb down your definition of success, and again, if you achieve a smaller milestone, that's great. Take that and then achieve a bigger one tomorrow.
And then I'll just quickly also add, then there's just the sheer numbers of the metrics. For example, I mean, sometimes it's, we were able to get, 3, a member of Congress office to send a dear colleague to their other members of Congress, getting them to support the legislation. It could be, how many, other groups that we get to sign on to a letter. So I think, in terms of just to share the metrics part of it, of how you define success, I think there are ways, that lobbyists or advocates have sort of looked at if you have to sort of say, here are the numbers, this is how many co-sponsors we actually have on this legislation, or, we got it passed in the House this year, but, now we have to reintroduce it, or we get it passed in the Senate the next time. So I think there's just kind of some of those, and I think all of those, I don't think the measure of success isn't whether we get the bill or not. I mean, obviously that's the goal and we want that, but there are, as we mentioned earlier, I think it's David or Chris, there are small wins along the way that lead to the larger win.
Yeah, Amy and Katie, if you guys have any final thoughts.
Tammy kind of stole the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, I don't think that we should measure success in advocacy because, we got this earmark, or because we got a bill passed. I mean, those are amazing victories, and those should for sure be celebrated. And those are the ones we aspire to. But there is great victory in educating your members of Congress and building awareness around your issue and elevating your constituency, whatever that is, whether that's in health or education or in infrastructure, any of those things, sharing your story and making the problem and potential solutions known to government, I think is a start. And folks often dive in and expect, well, we've been at this for 6 months and we don't have a bill yet, or, nobody's offered to hand us money. And it really is just like any relationship that you build at home or at work, or with your friends, it's a relationship building process with government, and it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes perseverance. So I think if anybody Pelotons on this audience, if you work out with Jess, she says celebrate every win and then keep on working, no matter how small the win. And I think that's some of our ethos with government affairs too. Celebrate the small ones and then just keep on moving so you can celebrate the big one.
Amy, any final thoughts?
I not on the goals. I will say both Chris and David mentioned harassment, and as lobbyists we call that persistent advocacy, not harassment. So you don't worry about that.
Yes, good advice. Awesome. Thank you all for joining us today. This was such a great discussion. I really want to thank each of our speakers, amazing backgrounds, amazing expertise, amazing passion and leadership. Boy, you are definitely changing the world a little bit at a time, and it's huge. So thank you to each of you. Thank you for all who dialed in. I want to make one other plug. We have the Shauna M. Sorrells Award that we do every year for wonderful smaller nonprofits. Check it out on our website. We will have online voting for the finalists to receive the award this year. We do it every fall. So please check that out on our website. And thank you all again. Keep being awesome change makers. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.